Andrew Richards had never planned to return to the suburbs. After years working in high-pressure environments, training service dogs for law enforcement, he'd thought he was done with neighborhoods, manicured lawns, and the slow grind of residential politics. But when his older brother passed away unexpectedly, leaving him a modest single-story house on the edge of a quiet town, Andrew took it as a sign. Not just a fresh start, but a purpose he hadn't realized he needed. The house wasn't fancy, but it was solid. Weathered brick, a wide porch, and in the backyard a shed that hadn't been touched in years. It was that shed, more than the house itself, that stirred something in Andrew. A tall, steel-framed structure with reinforced doors, it had once belonged to their father, and later became the workshop where Andrew and his brother spent countless hours as kids, tinkering with tools, fixing bikes, and hiding out when things at home got loud. Now it stood silent, dusty, and full of forgotten equipment. But to Andrew, it felt like a place that still had work to do. He didn't waste time. Within days of moving in, he had cleared it out, inspected the structure, and started converting it into a tactical dog training arena. Nothing extreme. Just enough space and equipment to work with a few young dogs on obedience, spatial awareness, and social integration. He wasn't taking clients yet. This was personal. He planned to eventually collaborate with local therapy programs to help train support dogs for veterans and elderly residents. It was all above board. He had informed the municipal office of the conversion and obtained written confirmation that the use of the shed didn't violate any zoning or property regulations. He even secured a small liability insurance policy just in case. For the first time in years, he felt grounded. The neighborhood seemed unremarkable at first glance. Retirees walking dogs, small families tending flower beds, the occasional kid riding a bike too fast down the sidewalk. Nobody paid Andrew much attention, which suited him just fine. But then came the knock. It was a Thursday morning, cool and bright, and he had just returned from a jog with one of the pups when a shadow crossed the frosted glass of his front door. Standing outside was a heavy-set woman in a pastel pink blazer, clutching a laminated folder. Her name was Karen. She introduced herself as a local coordinator and launched into a monologue about seasonal property compliance and shared infrastructure expectations. Her tone was cheerful, but her eyes were hard and calculating. Then came the ask. She recommended that Andrew consider turning over the shed for community storage, since no one else was really using theirs properly and it would benefit the whole block. Andrew, polite but firm, declined. Karen paused, smiled tightly, and said, "We'll see how that goes, Mr. Richards." It started with a letter, not one of those standard city notices printed on cheap paper, but something glossier, almost smug in its presentation. The envelope was thicker than it needed to be, sealed with an embossed emblem he didn't recognize, and inside was a multi-page notification of concern, outlining an alleged violation regarding the use of an outbuilding for unauthorized purposes, inconsistent with the intended communal character of the neighborhood. The phrasing was intentionally vague, as if it had been reviewed by a lawyer determined to imply wrongdoing without stating anything concrete. The letter claimed that several residents had expressed discomfort with the presence of military-style equipment and canine disturbances, and it included a list of recommended actions, at the top of which was the suggestion that Andrew voluntarily repurpose the shed or temporarily cease activity pending further review. At first, Andrew treated it like background noise. He had seen worse bureaucracy during his years working in the public sector. But by the end of the week, 3 more letters arrived, each with escalating tone and intensity. One included a clause about emergency authority to manage external storage structures, granted under local residential guidelines, and another contained a printed copy of a section from the neighborhood charter referencing discretionary oversight, powers related to noise-producing utility structures. It was clear now, this wasn't just a warning, it was a coordinated push. More disturbingly, none of the letters were signed by any single person. They were issued from a general civic affairs office, which Andrew knew didn't exist as a formal body under municipal governance. That meant someone had created a shell identity to give weight to their threats, someone who was used to operating under layers of procedural fog. On Saturday morning, Andrew drove to the town clerk's office and spent 2 hours with a public records assistant, combing through planning documents and zoning maps. As he expected, nothing had changed. His shed was on private land, and the only restrictions applied to permanent structural additions or industrial use, neither of which applied to his case. Armed with printouts and official stamps, he returned home and sent scanned copies along with a short email to the return address from the letter, though he suspected no one would reply. Later that evening, just after sunset, Andrew returned from a short walk to find the lock on the shed had been tampered with. Not broken, just subtly scratched, as if someone had tested it. He checked the surrounding area but found no prints, no signs of forced entry. Still, it was enough. He replaced the lock with a heavier-duty mechanism and installed a motion sensor above the door, linked to a silent alarm inside his house. That same night, while reviewing the footage from the backyard camera, he caught a glimpse of movement. A figure stepping into frame just far enough to be caught by the infrared lens before slipping out again. No face, no clear features, just a deliberate presence. By Monday, things escalated again. His access to the neighborhood's community website was revoked. It wasn't something he used often, but when he went to log in to view the bulletin board about waste pickup changes, his account was temporarily deactivated due to non-compliance. Attempts to reset his password were met with system errors. He called the help number listed at the bottom of the site and was met with a recording that said, "If you believe this is an error, please submit a printed request form to the Community Conduct Review Committee." He had never heard of such a committee. It was no longer about the shed. It was about pressure, escalating, targeted, and intentional. The goal wasn't just to inconvenience him, it was to force him to give up space, to isolate him, to wear him down until he complied. The dogs began reacting differently during training sessions, more alert, more agitated. One morning he found a small pile of nails scattered in the grass near the back gate, almost like someone had tried to slow him down without being obvious. When he called the non-emergency line to report the incident, the operator politely logged the complaint but offered no follow-up. "Unless you have footage or a witness, we can't initiate an investigation," she said. By midweek, Andrew knew he had to escalate the matter, but not in the way his frustration tempted him to. He contacted a local attorney who specialized in land use disputes. She reviewed his paperwork, listened to his situation, and within minutes told him he was doing everything right. On paper. "But that's not what this is about," she added. "They're not trying to win in court. They're trying to exhaust you before it ever gets there." She helped him draft a formal notice of legal awareness, neutral in tone but loaded with legal terminology, and submitted as a registered document to the town's administrative board. It didn't accuse anyone directly, but it made it clear that Andrew was prepared to take action if harassment or false claims continued. It also forced a paper trail. No longer could anonymous committees or vague notices operate in the dark. The day after the notice was filed, a small lawn sign appeared near his driveway. It was wedged into the soil at an angle, cheap and unbranded, but the message was deliberate. Community safety starts with conformity. It wasn't from the city. It wasn't a commercial ad. It was a message, and it was personal. Andrew didn't react the way they expected him to. He didn't respond to the sign with an angry letter or a complaint on the defunct community website. Instead, he waited. He reviewed the security footage from the night before, scanning through grainy black and white frames with the patience of someone who'd spent years watching body language and reaction cues in both dogs and humans. Just after 2:17 a.m., he spotted movement. A figure in a zip-up hoodie walked slowly along the edge of his fence line, keeping to the shadows. They paused near the side gate, looked around, and then planted the lawn sign firmly into the dirt before disappearing out of frame. It was too dark and too distant to identify the person. They moved like they'd done it before, like they knew how to avoid blind spots. Andrew didn't bother reporting it to the police. He already knew the script. No witness, no damage, no urgency. But the incident marked a shift. Whoever was behind this had graduated from policy manipulation to psychological tactics. The community was being used as a weapon against him, and it was working in ways that didn't leave fingerprints. 2 days later, a stranger appeared at his door posing as a city maintenance inspector. He was middle-aged, polite, and held a clipboard he never let Andrew see too closely. He claimed to be there for an audiometric inspection due to recent complaints about training whistles and barking sounds that exceeded the acceptable decibel level during daylight hours. Andrew asked for credentials, and the man hesitated, just long enough to confirm Andrew's suspicion. When pressed, the man handed over a card with no department name, just a printed phone number that rang endlessly when Andrew tested it minutes after the man had left. Andrew called the actual city noise ordinance office later that day. They had no record of any inspections scheduled in his area, and no employee by that name. That same week, one of his dogs came in from the yard limping slightly. At first, he thought it was a twisted paw or minor strain, but on closer inspection, he found a thin, rusted staple lodged near the pad. It wasn't something the dog could have stepped on naturally, not with how carefully he maintained the ground. He swept the area and found 3 more similar staples scattered loosely near the training perimeter. Someone had tossed them over the fence. It was subtle, deniable, and malicious. He didn't post about it online. He didn't call anyone in anger. He documented the injury, photographed the foreign objects with date and GPS data, and submitted a quiet report to Animal Welfare Enforcement Services. Not to provoke a scene, but to build a trail. Andrew knew that escalation was coming not just from one person, but from a strategy. Whoever had orchestrated this, likely Karen and maybe others, was leveraging influence through soft control. The kind that erodes your energy slowly, not with direct confrontation, but with persistent nudges meant to isolate and wear down resistance. That strategy extended to the neighborhood itself. At the local corner store where Andrew bought dog food in bulk, the clerk who used to chat with him now barely made eye contact. When he tried to schedule a landscaping service to reinforce his fence line, he was told that the company had scheduling conflicts indefinitely. Neighbors who once nodded as they walked by now crossed the street. It wasn't dramatic, just consistent. Even the dogs felt it. Their alertness went up, and their energy during training became harder to redirect. They were picking up on the tension, the shift in his rhythm. Rather than retreat, Andrew shifted his strategy. He didn't try to fix the neighborhood's perception or prove himself innocent in some invisible court of public opinion. He turned his attention inward and got serious. He brought in a private contractor, licensed, quiet, and discreet, to help upgrade the shed. Reinforced doors, dual locks, climate-controlled flooring, and a revised layout that maximized sound insulation. He added discrete vertical blinds to the small side windows and installed low-intensity motion lights that activated only within 10 feet of the structure. His work wasn't paranoid, it was precise. He also registered the location as a nonprofit training affiliate under an umbrella organization that worked with support animals for PTSD treatment. It wasn't about turning the space into a fortress. It was about making it untouchable without triggering legal exposure. The final straw came a week later. Andrew returned from the hardware store and found a notice taped crookedly to his front gate. The ink had run slightly in the rain, but the headline was legible. Warning: unauthorized animal handling under review. It was printed on plain paper with no letterhead, no official seal, no signature, just bolded phrases like safety concern, unregulated animal behavior, and community disruption. He looked up and saw Karen 2 houses down, standing on her porch with a plastic watering can she wasn't using. Their eyes met and she smiled, bright and fake, as if nothing were out of the ordinary. Andrew stood still for a long moment, his keys still in his hand. Then he calmly walked to the gate, peeled off the paper, folded it once, and placed it in his back pocket. He didn't give her the satisfaction of a reaction. Instead, he entered the house, brewed a pot of coffee, sat at the table, and opened his laptop. He spent the next 3 hours drafting a comprehensive report. It wasn't addressed to the police or to a useless email inbox. It was for his lawyer, who would know how to escalate it to the right administrative levels. He included everything: dates, times, photos, observations, and a clear narrative of coordinated attempts at harassment and property interference. He didn't need a confrontation. He needed leverage. And this time, he was building it not with words or warnings, but with paper, law, and precision. The shift came not with a bang, but with a letter that looked, for once, official. It was delivered by courier, not mail, with Andrew's full name typed cleanly on the envelope. Inside was a notification from the municipal licensing office informing him that a formal review of his property usage had been initiated following a multi-party complaint regarding potential zoning violations related to animal training operations. It wasn't a direct accusation, but it was a step beyond veiled threats and phony signs. This time, someone had gone through channels. The attached packet included a demand for documentation, proof of land use compatibility, licensing for training activity, and a written explanation of noise abatement measures. all due within 10 business days. Most alarming was the line indicating that a field inspection could be authorized at any time. It was a strategic move, administrative fatigue dressed as civic oversight. Andrew knew the complaint wasn't spontaneous. He had already submitted all his compliance paperwork months ago when establishing the shed as a recognized training space. But what this maneuver accomplished wasn't legal progress. It was bureaucratic obstruction designed to slow him down and drain his time. It meant someone had taken the time to formally weaponize the city's mechanisms against him, not just in whispers or signs, but on public record. It also meant his previous strategy of quietly documenting and reporting wouldn't be enough anymore. He couldn't afford to stay passive, not when the attacks were escalating from passive sabotage to administrative warfare. He scheduled a meeting with his attorney the next morning. She was direct as always. "It's not about whether you're in the right," she said, thumbing through the packet. "It's about how long they can force you to prove it, again and again." She helped him draft a formal response, clean and neutral, that reiterated his compliance and challenged the vague language of the complaint. She also submitted a request to identify the parties who filed the complaint, a move that wouldn't yield immediate names but would establish his intent to fight back with transparency. They discussed the likelihood of a surprise inspection and prepared documentation to be readily accessible on site, including a laminated sheet posted inside the shed outlining the facility's lawful use. 3 days later, as expected, the inspection occurred. Andrew received no warning. He was in the middle of a boundary recall drill with 2 of the younger shepherds when a white municipal car pulled up, and 2 inspectors, 1 official, 1 trainee, stepped out. They introduced themselves politely but asked firm questions. Did the dog stay overnight? Were any medications administered on site? What sound barriers were used during commands? Andrew answered with the calm, precise tone he reserved for high-pressure demonstrations, showed them the soundproofing upgrades, allowed access to the shed, and presented his permits. The dogs, trained for behavioral therapy scenarios, remained silent and composed during the entire visit. The lead inspector, to his credit, seemed both surprised and impressed. As they were leaving, the younger inspector paused. He gestured vaguely toward the houses behind Andrew's fence and said, "Some folks around here really don't want dogs this close." It wasn't said with malice, more like an observation. Andrew simply nodded. They're going to have to get used to it. What he didn't expect was the fallout after the inspection. The very next day, 2 landscaping companies he'd used in the past canceled future appointments. An order for replacement training harnesses from a local supplier was lost in the system. And during his weekly grocery run, the cashier who had always chatted with him now offered a tight-lipped nod, her tone clipped and formal. It wasn't personal, these people weren't hostile, but the neighborhood pressure was mounting in the quietest, most effective way possible. Slow erosion of trust, connection, and convenience. The social oxygen around him was being methodically sucked out. Karen was nowhere to be seen during this period, which told Andrew everything he needed to know. She was operating from behind the curtain again, likely feeding misinformation to just enough people to seed doubt without exposing herself. But even without seeing her, her influence was visible, especially the day he returned from an errand and found a circular left at his gate. Dog handling safety. Know the risks. Featuring a silhouette of a snarling dog and a series of exaggerated statistics. No author, no sender, just folded and placed beneath the latch. Andrew didn't rip it up. He scanned it, added it to the digital log he had been compiling, and then carefully placed the original into a weatherproof envelope which he stapled to the inside of the shed's bulletin board with the handwritten note, "Submitted anonymously. Let's discuss facts, not fiction." It wasn't a provocation. It was a challenge to the narrative being spun around him. He wasn't hiding anymore. He was responding, publicly, legally, and methodically. And then something unexpected happened. A few nights later, long after dark, someone left a package at his front door. Inside was a small envelope and a wrapped object. The envelope contained a handwritten note. "I don't like what she's doing either. You're not the only one." No name, no return address. The wrapped object was a damaged metal sign, one of the community safety signs that had been planted weeks earlier. It had been bent nearly in half. Andrew didn't know who left it, but for the first time since this began, he felt a shift in the current. Someone else had broken ranks. Someone else was watching, and not silently. If the inspection was the first public shot across the bow, what followed next was a full campaign. Not in the open, but carried out with the steady hand of someone who knew exactly where to apply pressure without ever leaving fingerprints. Just 3 days after the silent package arrived, Andrew received another official-looking letter. This time, it bore the letterhead of the city's Environmental Health Division and alleged that waste management issues had been reported on his property, specifically improper disposal of animal-related byproducts and excessive accumulation of training materials potentially attracting pests. It was an absurd accusation on its face. Andrew was meticulous about cleanliness, kept digital logs of waste disposal, and had a monthly sanitation contractor on retainer who could verify every removal. But that wasn't the point. The point was to initiate a new line of attack that sounded legitimate enough to trigger an investigation, another round of documentation, and another stain on his perceived standing within the community. He didn't take the bait. Instead, he contacted his sanitation provider, obtained a notarized statement confirming service dates and procedures, and attached it to a formal response that he sent both digitally and by certified mail. But the emotional impact was harder to brush off. This wasn't about a disagreement anymore. It was about attrition, about making him question the worth of defending what had once been a quiet life. And even that was being eroded. More troubling than the paper war, however, were the subtle physical incursions that started around the same time. His garbage bins were overturned twice in the span of a week, each time late at night with no natural cause, no wind, no animal prints, just deliberate positioning in the middle of the driveway. One morning he found that someone had poured a thin line of bleach along the grass by the back fence, killing a streak of turf in a perfect arc, just far enough from the cameras to avoid capture. It was calculated and quiet and laced with pettiness, the sort of move someone uses when they want to remind you that you're vulnerable without pushing you far enough to warrant a police report. And it worked. The dogs picked up on his agitation. Their routines shifted. Their concentration dropped. And for the first time since training began, one of them failed to respond to a basic recall command during a trial drill. That moment rattled Andrew far more than the bleach or the garbage bins. His entire program was based on consistency, trust, and calm authority. If that structure wavered, the entire foundation could collapse. He didn't blame the dogs. He blamed the pressure, the distractions, the silent war being fought on his doorstep. And so, instead of retreating, he adapted. He restructured the schedule. Shorter drills with lower stimulation, more emphasis on bonding and scent-focused games, less emphasis on command-heavy regimens. He brought in a behavioral consultant from out of town, someone he trusted implicitly, not just to assess the dogs, but to evaluate him. Her verdict was blunt but honest. They're feeding off you. You're carrying stress in your posture, in your voice, in your rhythm. You've got to shift the energy. So he did. He delegated tasks, allowed the consultant to lead for a few days, and focused on the infrastructure, resealing the perimeter fencing, upgrading the drainage system, and reconfiguring the lighting to better cover blind spots. But then came the move that clarified the endgame. Karen, now operating openly once more, began circulating a petition through the neighborhood. She wasn't calling for the removal of Andrew's dogs or the shed. Instead, she couched her initiative in language about returning communal harmony, preserving the residential aesthetic, and reviewing usage exceptions granted without proper democratic oversight. In simpler terms, she was pushing to establish a formal neighborhood charter amendment that would give the community collective authority to vote on property usage beyond what the city required. It was an end run around law, an attempt to shift the power base and create a system where perception and popularity could override legality. Andrew caught wind of it not through a notice, but through a neighbor. A quiet man, 2 houses down, who had never spoken more than a few words. He knocked on Andrew's door with a copy of the petition in hand, unsigned. "She dropped this off earlier," he said, offering no opinion, just the facts. Andrew took it, thanked him, and read through the language carefully. It was clever. Every paragraph emphasized unity, values, tradition, the kind of document that sounded noble until you realized it was a weapon disguised as a welcome mat. He didn't respond publicly. He didn't print rebuttals or stand on his porch making speeches. Instead, he contacted a retired judge, an acquaintance of his late brother who specialized in residential charter law. Together, they drafted a legal opinion outlining the overreach in Karen's proposed amendment, citing precedent from cases where similar neighborhood power grabs had failed due to conflict with existing municipal codes. They didn't publish it. They quietly mailed copies to every homeowner on the street, with a brief cover letter explaining the legal risk they'd assume by signing something that attempted to override existing property rights. The response wasn't immediate, but over the next week, Karen's presence on the street became noticeably less frequent. The petition never resurfaced, but the silence that followed was heavier than victory. It was the kind of silence that hinted at a new strategy forming in the background. Andrew didn't take comfort in it. He knew better. He knew the battle hadn't ended, just shifted terrain again. And this time, he wasn't going to wait to be caught off guard. He began drafting a new proposal, not just to defend his space, but to elevate it. A public partnership offer with a local veterans outreach program, positioning the shed as a pilot site for rehabilitative animal training in underserved neighborhoods. Not just a defense. A counterattack made of purpose. The tension, which had simmered quietly for weeks, finally snapped one humid evening when Andrew returned from a meeting with the local veterans liaison to find his property gate left wide open. He always closed it. Always. And he knew no delivery or visitor had been scheduled that day. His stomach dropped as he stepped out of the truck, scanning the perimeter. The lights on the east fence, recently upgraded with motion sensors, were off. Dead. The training yard was silent, eerily so, and as he approached the shed, he saw it. The door was ajar, not broken open but manipulated. Someone had picked the lock or bypassed it altogether and gone inside without triggering an alarm. The dogs were safe, still in their kennels, unharmed. But inside the shed, the damage was surgical. Not vandalism, not chaos, just violation. His records drawer had been pulled open, selective files removed and tossed on the floor. One of the floor mats used for reaction training had been slashed once through the center, a single clean cut from a blade too sharp for randomness. Worst of all, a large bag of training treats, kept sealed for health standards, had been slit open and left spilled across the work table, soaked in a clear, sour-smelling liquid Andrew immediately recognized as ammonia. It wasn't just an attempt to disrupt. It was an act of dominance, something meant to degrade, to mark territory, to leave a psychological scar. He didn't shout, didn't panic. He quietly locked down the yard, moved the dogs indoors, documented everything with photos, then drove straight to the police department. Not to the non-emergency line, not through online forms, but in person. At the front desk, he asked to speak to a detective, calmly and without theatrics. It took time, but eventually he was led to a back office where he presented everything: photos, dates, neighborhood letters, anonymous notices, and now physical contamination of his workspace. The detective, a tall man with a measured tone, asked questions. Serious ones. And Andrew could tell that, for the first time, the situation had crossed the line from property dispute into potential criminal targeting. Over the next 48 hours, the tone of everything changed. The detective followed up with him, sent a crime scene tech to swab the ammonia-soaked table, and requested camera footage. Andrew handed it over, and while the culprit had avoided the obvious angles, one partial frame, a silhouette near the utility gate, was enough to start raising internal flags. Then came the twist. A day later, the same neighbor who had first delivered the unsigned petition knocked on Andrew's door again. This time, he looked anxious, carrying a manila envelope under his arm. "You didn't get this from me," he said flatly and handed it over without further explanation. Inside were printed emails, screenshots from a private neighborhood chat group, and a spreadsheet that listed homes, owners, and annotations next to each one. Code words, colored cells, vague labels like sympathetic, dormant, and under Andrew's name in red, unstable plus obstructive. It was a blacklist. Karen's work, no doubt. A system of tracking dissent and consolidating pressure across the neighborhood with quiet social conditioning. And it explained everything. The cold shoulders, the disappearing services, the muted hostility. It wasn't just one woman's grudge, it was an organized system of community manipulation built on fear and silence. Andrew scanned the documents, took photos, and drove them to his lawyer, who looked through them in stunned silence before saying, "This is conspiracy-level misconduct, and if any of this involved city employees, she's in deeper than she realizes." They filed a formal criminal complaint the next morning. News traveled quickly, but Andrew didn't say a word to anyone on the street. He continued his work as if nothing had changed. The dogs resumed training. The shed remained sealed except to vetted collaborators, but behind the scenes, the tide was turning. The detective assigned to the case had begun interviewing residents quietly, and some of them, freed by the knowledge that someone else had acted first, started talking. 2 admitted they had signed petitions without reading them. One revealed that Karen had threatened to report her for building code violations if she didn't cooperate. And one, anonymously, provided a copy of a message Karen had sent, urging others to avoid speaking to police unless instructed by the block committee. That term, block committee, didn't exist legally, but now it was in the record. The culmination came not with sirens or public arrests, but with a simple city hearing scheduled 10 days later to review the complaint of coordinated harassment and property interference. Karen appeared, dressed neatly, smiling tightly, accompanied by an attorney who seemed unaware of the storm he was walking into. Andrew arrived prepared, calm, collected, with his lawyer, the packet of evidence, and a printed timeline of events that connected each escalation. The hearing wasn't dramatic, it was procedural, but as the evidence unfolded, surveillance images, falsified communications, and anonymous witness statements, the members of the review board began to shift visibly in their seats. Karen tried to deflect, claiming it was all exaggerated, that she was only trying to preserve neighborhood standards. Her lawyer tried to argue that everything she had done fell within the rights of a concerned resident. But it was too late. The board concluded the session with a recommendation for further investigation into the harassment network, and the city's legal office opened a civil liability review against Karen for her role in what was now being called a coordinated pattern of undue influence and community coercion. Her privileges within the residential oversight structure were revoked, pending the outcome of the investigation, and she was issued a direct order not to contact Andrew or his property in any form. As she left the building, she didn't look at him. Her posture had changed. No more smiles, no fake concern. Just silence, taut and sharp. For Andrew, it wasn't triumph. Not really. The damage had been done, the shed violated, trust shattered, but it was the end of her reach. And in that silence, in that quiet fall from control, was something far more powerful than any confrontation. In the weeks following the hearing, the atmosphere around the neighborhood shifted noticeably. Not in dramatic, sweeping gestures, but in the subtle ways people began making eye contact again, nodding hello instead of pretending not to see him. Small acknowledgments. Quiet, cautious, but real. The once frequent tension in the air, that unspoken pressure hanging over his property like a storm cloud, began to dissipate. Andrew didn't gloat, didn't go out of his way to celebrate the outcome. He stuck to his schedule, maintained the grounds, trained the dogs, and kept the shed as clean and precise as ever. The only change he allowed himself was a sign, subtle, hand-carved, mounted above the shed door. Respect is earned in silence. Most didn't understand the message, but a few did, and that was enough. Karen disappeared from street view almost entirely. Her house remained occupied, but her car was gone most days, and neighbors stopped referencing her in conversation. The enforcement network she'd quietly built collapsed without her constant coordination. Those who had once enabled her now kept their distance, unwilling to admit their role but no longer participating in her efforts. Her name surfaced only once more, in a formal notice from the city informing residents of a restructuring of the community oversight body, citing misuse of influence and procedural violations. No one protested. Andrew's proposal to partner with the Veterans Outreach Program was quietly approved by the city. He received a small grant. Not much, but enough to outfit the shed with new gear, reinforce the fencing, and bring in a part-time coordinator who would help expand the training into weekend programs for retired service members and first responders. Slowly, what had started as an attempt to protect a shed evolved into something bigger, something with reach and permanence. Families began asking if they could visit with their kids. A local high school sent 2 students for a community project. The noise complaints stopped. The dogs thrived. One morning, as the sun rose over the yard and the air still held that early autumn crispness, Andrew stood at the edge of the field, watching one of the younger dogs, alert, focused, balanced, respond perfectly to a long-distance command. He didn't smile, didn't cheer. He just nodded once to himself, understanding finally that what he'd built here couldn't be taken down by signatures, whispers, or sabotage. The shed stood not just as a structure, but as a statement, a piece of quiet resistance against control, masked as order. And as he turned back toward the house, coffee in hand and boots damp with dew, he knew with absolute certainty. He had not just won the fight, he had redefined the field.